Good evening, my little creatures of the night. Mr. Wendigo back again. And boy, have I got a tale that'll absolutely whistle past your spine tonight. Arroyo Seco, New Mexico, where the Sangre de Cristo mountains cut the sky like broken teeth and the river bends in ways the old Pueblo people learned to avoid. Where 3 years ago, a house came down and 2 boys didn't walk away. The locals know some places refuse to stay quiet. They know some debts don't get paid with survival. Tonight, 2 survivors returned to finish what the buffalo couldn't. This is your late night creature feature. Sometimes the second act is always bloodier than the first. Before we begin, I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Alone in your room? Driving through empty roads? Walking past a river? Drop a comment and let me know. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. Now then, let's talk about what waits in the water. Chapter 1. The Reckoning begins. The whistle came back to Miles in his sleep. It always did. 3 years of nights, and it never failed, that sound sliding into his dreams like a knife between ribs, high and thin and impossibly steady, as if something had learned to breathe without lungs. It filled the ruined house again in his mind, crawled under the tar paper, wrapped around the wooden staircase, and pulled. In the dream, he was always 18 again, legs dangling off the roof with Tay-Tay and J-Rod beside him, the summer of 1985 stretching infinite and golden before the darkness came. Watching Tay-Tay step off the edge like there was ground beneath him that only he could see. Watching Tyler's grip slip on J-Rod's blood-slick arm, fingers sliding, gone. Then came the bones, clicking like teeth in the dark, stacking themselves, building something with patience that felt older than the mountains. Miles woke with his hand strangling the edge of a stained mattress, breath coming in ragged gasps. The taste of soot and river mud thick in his mouth, though he was 200 miles from that water and 3 years downstream from that night. The shack around him hummed with the particular silence of a place too cheap to have appliances that made noise. No fridge compressor, no clock. Just the slow groan of plywood settling in the pre-dawn cool, and the scratch of wind-blown sand against the walls. He was 21 now, should have felt like a man. Felt more like a weapon someone kept sharpening without permission. He lay still, forcing his breathing to slow, counting the way his therapist in Santa Fe had taught him before he'd stopped going because talking about it only made the whistle louder in his head. 1 breath. 2. 3. By 10, his heart had stopped trying to punch through his sternum. By 20, he could unclench his fingers from the sheet without them cramping. The drawings watched him from the walls. He taped them everywhere over the past 3 years, charcoal sketches on newsprint, ballpoint studies on the backs of receipts, careful anatomical renderings on proper paper he'd bought with money from his father's stone shop. Every wall held pieces of the thing that had taken J-Rod and Tay-Tay, long hands with too many joints. A mouth that opened wider than physics should allow, teeth layered like a shark's. Eyes that weren't eyes so much as holes where light went to die, the staircase where darkness seemed to flex and breathe. The pile of bones arranged with surgical precision against the foundation. He stared at them until the lines were only lines again, until his chest stopped stuttering, until the creature on the walls became just charcoal and obsession instead of memory with claws. Outside, the high desert was the kind of quiet that made its own sound a hum at the edge of hearing, pressure in the ears like ascending too fast. The wind came slow across the scrub and old tires and the spine of a rusted-out Ford someone had abandoned in the arroyo behind his property. It carried the clean reek of creosote and the piss-sour musk of a coyote gone by in the night, marking territory that would never really belong to anything. Far off, a dog barked twice and gave up like it knew better than to expect an answer. The sun was still trapped behind the Sangre de Cristo mountains to the east, a purple blade across the horizon promising heat that hadn't arrived yet. Miles pulled on his boots, steel-toed work boots worn soft in all the right places, laces double-knotted the way his father had taught him when he was 8. He slid the knife from beneath his pillow and tucked it into his belt. Fixed blade, 4 inches of carbon steel he'd sharpened on a whetstone until it could split paper with gravity alone. He rolled his shoulder and felt the hurt wake. The scars. 4 white puckers across his right shoulder blade where the thing had raked him on the roof 3 years ago. Claws like bone hooks pressed into his flesh by something with too many fingers and no understanding of mercy. They'd healed badly, keloid tissue raised and tight, aching in weather changes and in dreams and on mornings like this when the air itself felt like a warning. The doctors had said he was lucky another inch and it would have severed the muscle group, left his arm weak and useless. Miles didn't feel lucky. He felt marked, claimed. Like the thing had signed its name in his skin and was just waiting to come back and finish the signature. He stepped out into what he generously called a yard. Yard was charitable. It was a rectangle of earth tamped hard by 3 years of his feet and the weight of the obstacle course he'd stitched together from salvage and spite. A run of bald tires he'd dug into the ground in a line, each one half buried so they wouldn't shift when he hopped through them at speed. 2 telephone poles he'd found behind the municipal yard, leaned at angles to make a low crawl that scraped his back bloody if he didn't keep flat enough. A wall built from pallets wired to rebar he'd scavenged, 8 feet high, that he climbed until his fingers bled and calused over and bled again. A length of frayed climbing rope slung over an old windmill support, the kind of rope that would hold your weight right up until it decided not to. Hanging from a mesquite branch at the far end, he'd bolted a buffalo femur he'd found near the highway 3 months after moving here. Some rancher's herd had lost a calf to something, coyotes probably. Maybe a cat and Miles had walked out one morning to find the skeleton picked clean by scavengers and sun. He'd taken the femur, wire-brushed it, drilled a hole through the condyle, and hung it from the mesquite with logging chain. It swung like a pendulum when the wind took it, bone-white and hollow-sounding. Above it, he'd wired a ring of rusted license plates he'd collected New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, one from Oklahoma that was so faded you could barely read it. If he hit the femur dead center with the spear, the impact would travel up the chain and rattle the plates. They'd sing a high, discordant note that made his teeth ache. He told himself he liked the sound, told himself it was just training. But some part of him, the part that still heard the whistle in quiet moments, knew he was teaching himself to hit a moving target that sounded wrong when it died. He ran, bare-chested in the cool dawn, lungs burning in the thin desert air at 6,500 feet, breath pluming white in the shadows where the sun hadn't reached yet. He drove his knees high through the tire run, each impact jarring up through his ankles, into his knees, into his hips, the rhythm of it drowning out thought. Because if he let himself think, he saw J-Rod's hand slipping through Tyler's grip, the skin tearing like wet paper, blood hot and slick and failing. He saw Tay-Tay's face in the moment before he stepped off the roof, eyes glassy and distant like he was looking at something beautiful that only he could see. Miles hit the belly crawl and dropped, eating dust, spitting it out in angry bursts as he dragged himself onto the poles. His shoulders screamed, the old scars pulled tight enough to make his eyes water. He rolled to his feet at the end, grabbed the rope, and climbed hand over hand until his arms shook like epilepsy. At the top he could see the mountains clear, the Sangres blazing pink now as the sun found them, snow on the high peaks that never really melted even in August. He could see the whole sprawl of high desert stretching west toward Albuquerque, could see the ribbon of highway and the scatter of buildings that was barely a town. He could see the path north toward Arroyo Seco. He dropped hard, knees absorbing the impact, rolled, came up with the spear already in his hands. The spear had been a broom handle when he'd scrounged it from behind a taqueria in Santa Fe 6 months after the night on the roof. The owner had been throwing out broken mops and busted furniture, and Miles had asked if he could take the handle. The man had looked at him like he was crazy, but shrugged and said, "Take whatever you want, kid." Miles had sanded it for hours in his father's shop, working the rough grain smooth, learning the weight of it, the balance point. Then he'd bought a length of rebar from the hardware store and a tube of industrial epoxy that the guy behind the counter said would bond anything to anything as long as you didn't mind the fumes. He'd wired and epoxied the rebar to the head of the spear, let it cure for 3 days, then ground the end down on his father's belt grinder until it came to a point that split the air with a neat, angry hiss. It wasn't balanced like a proper spear. It was nose-heavy, awkward, the kind of weapon that would throw your shoulder out if you used it wrong. But Miles had thrown it 10,000 times in 3 years, and his body had learned the compensation. Learned to torque his hips just right, snap his wrist at the release point, follow through with his shoulder rolling forward to absorb the recoil. He found the line he'd scratched in the dirt 15 feet from the femur, the distance where accuracy started to matter and through. The spear flew true. It hit the femur with a sound like someone striking a church bell with a wrench, a deep metallic thong that shivered through the bone and up the chain. The license plates rattled and sang, a high, discordant chorus that made the coyotes in the arroyo shut up for a second before starting again. Miles walked forward, yanked the spear free, it always stuck, the point catching in the marrow cavity, and walked back to the line. He threw again, and again, and again. Over and over until the ring of plates stuttered into silence because he'd hit the same spot so many times the bone was starting to crack, until his right shoulder throbbed like the old wound had heat behind it, until sweat ran down his ribs in tracks that caught dust and turned to mud. He wiped his face with the back of his forearm, stared past the scrub toward the mountains. The sun had fully climbed now, pinking the snow stripes that never really left the ridges even in June. 3 years. 1,000 mornings. Every single one starting like this: run, climb, bleed a little, throw until the plates sang, then come inside and sit with the stories he'd collected like ammunition. He'd begged for some of them, traded tools and labor for others, sat in the corners of bars in Taos and Cuesta and Arroyo Seco itself, nursing a beer he didn't want, listening to old men who talked only when their cups were empty and their eyes slid past you to a country in their heads that looked like yours but wasn't. He'd written it all down in a tidy block print that looked too careful for a kid who slept with a knife, filling 3 spiral notebooks with rules and warnings and fragments of folklore that all said the same thing in different words. Don't whistle at night. Water keeps what it takes. Avoid the wrong bend where bones gather after floods. Leave offerings of salt and cedar if you have to, cross at dusk. If you break a rule, you don't fix it with another rule, you fix it by leaving before the thing decides you belong to it now. But Miles hadn't left. He'd stayed within striking distance for 3 years, circling Arroyo Seco like a wolf circles a trap, getting closer, learning, waiting for the right moment. Waiting until he was strong enough, fast enough, angry enough. Waiting until he heard the whistle again and knew it wasn't memory anymore. It had come to him on his 21st birthday, 2 months ago. April desert night, cold and star-bright, the wind carrying nothing but the smell of sage and the distant yelp of coyotes working something to death in the dark. Miles had been standing in this yard with the spear planted in the dirt beside him, one hand still on the shaft, staring at nothing and thinking about the fact that he'd made it to 21 when J-Rod and Tay-Tay hadn't made it to 19. That's when the whistle had come. High, thin, deliberate. It slipped across the scrub like a thread pulled through cloth, steady and impossible, the note holding longer than any human lungs could sustain. The sound had turned his bones cold before his scalp had time to prickle with it. He'd spun, yanking the spear free, scanning the darkness with every nerve ending screaming, but there was nothing. Just the scrub, just the dark, just a beetle scuttling over a rock, going about its business like the world wasn't ending. He could have told himself it was memory playing tricks, could have told himself it was wind through a crack in the shack's plywood, or a night bird, or his own guilt taking shape in the air. But his hands had been steady when he gripped the spear. His breath had been even, and the scar under his shoulder had burned as if an invisible fingertip had pressed into the old wound and held there, testing. That was when he'd understood. The promise he'd made to himself the day Paige drove them out of Arroyo Seco, the one he'd never spoken aloud because it felt too big for a kid's mouth, too heavy for words, had grown up with him. It was a man's promise now, and the thing in the river knew he was coming. It was calling him home, and home was hungry. Miles broke camp fast. What he thought he'd need had been waiting by the door for weeks anyway. Packed and repacked so many times he could inventory it blind. The short bow his father had bought him 2 years ago for his 19th birthday, a 35-pound recurve that Paige had purchased from a pawn shop and then never asked about. Never questioned why his son suddenly wanted to learn archery. The arrows Miles had made himself from dowel rods, each one carefully sanded and weighted, tipped with 3-blade broadheads he'd bought at a swap meet from a man who didn't ask why a 20-year-old needed hunting points designed to cause maximum bleeding. The spear, of course. Always the spear. 2 knives, the fixed blade from under his pillow and a folder his father had given him when he was 16, back before Arroyo Seco, back when knives were just tools and not promises. A coil of old climbing rope, static line rated for 800 pounds that he'd tested on the windmill frame by hanging from it until his grip failed. A canteen. A first aid kit that was mostly gauze and duct tape because that's what everything became eventually. And the pouch? The pouch was tied with red thread and filled with salt and cedar shavings, and a sliver of obsidian he'd cut his thumb on the day he found it in an arroyo 6 months ago. Obsidian remembers, someone had told him once. He didn't know who. Maybe an aunt he'd never had, or a grandmother who'd died before he was born, or just something the desert had whispered when he wasn't paying attention, but he believed it. Obsidian was volcanic glass, born in fire and violence, sharp enough to cut on a molecular level. If anything could hurt something made of stolen voices and old malice, it would be a stone that remembered what it was like to be molten rage. Paige found him lacing his boots tight enough to leave red rings around his ankles. His father filled the doorway sideways, still big the way trucks are big, all weight and wear and the promise they'll go as far as you ask until the axle finally snaps. But he looked older now. The crease at the corners of his eyes had gone from smile lines to furrows. His hair had grayed at the temples. His hands, always scarred from stonework, carried new cuts that didn't heal as fast as they used to. 3 years since Arroyo Seco and Paige had never been the same. He didn't talk about what he'd seen when he came back from that Colorado haul and found the house reduced to rubble and splinters, his son in a hospital bed covered in bandages, and 2 brothers gone with nothing but a sheriff's report that said stampede and bad luck. But Miles had seen it in his eyes every day since the knowledge that his boy had survived something that shouldn't exist, and the worse knowledge that it wasn't over. "You going somewhere, kid?" Paige said, trying to sound like he didn't know, trying to sound like this was just about a ride and a girl and a night that would end with breakfast and a story. "Seco," Miles said. He kept his head down and worked the bootlace until it bit into the leather tongue. He felt the weight of the pouch in his pocket and was stupidly glad for it, like the feel of it could make a dent in what was coming. Paige's jaw moved like he was chewing something bitter. He wasn't a man who prayed out loud, but sometimes you could see it in his face when the last tool in the box wasn't the one you needed and you were out of options. "You take the pickup," he said finally, fishing keys from his pocket. "Don't ride that junker bike all the way up there, and you come back when you see whatever you think you need to see." "I'm not going to see it," Miles said, meeting his father's eyes for the first time. "I'm going to end it." Paige stared at him for a heartbeat that stretched like taffy. He did not say, "I saw the insurance report. I filed the claim." I held Tyler's grandfather's shoulder while he shook like a seizure and listened to men who fought in Korea tell me it was just buffalo and bad foundations and too much whiskey. He did not say, "I went through what was left of our house with a nail apron and a crowbar because I thought I could fix it, thought I could at least tear it down to studs and understand what happened." and the studs breathed when I touched them. He did not say, "I haven't slept through a full night since." He rubbed his thumb and forefinger together as if he could roll that feeling into a pill and swallow it. "You come back," Paige said. Not a request. An order from a father who'd already lost too much. Miles slung the bow over his shoulder and hefted the spear. "I'll bring back quiet." Paige let him pass. In the hard light of the yard, for just a second, his father looked as young and tired as he'd looked that first day they pulled into Arroyo Seco, a man trying to make a place out of a husk because he'd been told men did that for their boys, because he didn't know what else to do with his hands if they weren't busy holding something together. He caught Miles' sleeve. "You see, Tyler," he said, not a question. Advice that sounded like an order because Paige knew no other way to put words on worry. "If you go, you don't go alone." "I know where he is," Miles said. He did. He'd kept tabs on Tyler Loveless for 3 years, the way you keep tabs on the only other person who knows what the dark sounds like when it's hungry. Chapter 2. Gathering the Four. The shop was 3 doors down from a pawn where a saxophone leaned in the window, gathering dust and optimism it would never spend. The sign above the bay said Gabriel's Auto and Bike in faded letters, though everybody just called it Gabe's. And sometimes, when the actual Gabriel wasn't around, they called it Tyler's place because the kid practically lived there. The smell hit Miles before he even reached the open bay door. Oil and hot metal and the particular reek of brake cleaner that gets into your sinuses and stays there for hours. Sparks snapped from a MIG torch somewhere behind a leaning wall of tires stacked 6 high. A radio squawked thin norteño through static that made the accordion sound like it was drowning. Tyler sat on a milk crate with a carburetor in his lap, a cigarette welded to his lower lip as if someone had told him when he was 12 that if he let it fall he would die. He was built narrow and hard now, forearms cabled with muscle under black smudges of grease. The gap-toothed kid who used to joke about turning pro and landing magazine covers had learned how to fold his mouth so it hid more than it said. His hands moved with the automatic precision of 3 years doing the same tasks over and over: disassemble, clean, inspect, reassemble, therapy without talking. "Miles," he said without looking up. Somehow he knew. Maybe the same way you always know when a storm is about to roll off the mountain and tear the plastic off your roof. "Tyler. You need a carb? I got 2 that don't hate being alive. You need a rear tire? You're going to wait till tomorrow because the delivery guy is in a fight with his wife again and can't be bothered. You need me to fix your brakes? You leave keys and an apology for driving with hope instead of pads." Tyler's voice had gravel in it that hadn't been there at 18. Edges scraped by 3 years of smoke and whiskey and waking up reaching for brothers who weren't there anymore. He set the carburetor on the workbench like it was a heart he was tired of trying to restart, and looked up. Even with the angle of the bay shadow cutting his face in half, he looked older than 21. It wasn't lines. It was the way his eyes moved away from sharp corners out of habit, the way his mouth found the cigarette automatically when a word threatened to be honest, the way he held his shoulders slightly hunched, like he was permanently braced for something to come at him from behind. "Come with me," Miles said. Tyler snorted and jammed the cigarette back in his mouth, smoke curling up past his eyes. "Where? Church?" "Arroyo Seco." The torch cut off in the back bay. The sudden silence hummed with nothing but the radio and the heat and the buzz that sneaks into your ears when you're near men who've gone too long without saying what they should have said years ago. Somewhere deeper in the shop, a wrench clanged and a curse crawled out of a throat and died before it made the air. Tyler turned his head and spit a bitter streak onto the concrete floor. "We're 21, he said flatly. "We don't go back." "You and me were 18 when we didn't get a choice," Miles said. He reached into his pocket and touched the pouch of salt like a worry stone. "It's still there. I heard it." "You heard wind," Tyler said. He scrubbed a black thumb across his cheekbone and left a crooked comet of grease. You heard what you wanted to hear because you've been sleeping under drawings of that thing like it's a girl you don't have the guts to talk to. I heard it, Miles said again. His voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. You don't have to want this. That part's done. Tyler watched him for a long time, gray smoke drifting between them like a line neither of them wanted to cross. Behind him, next bay over, a motorcycle sat up on a lift. A long black shovelhead that had seen better owners and worse roads, chrome-pitted, seat wrapped in duct tape, foot pegs worn down to the bolts. It looked like it wanted a fight, so it didn't have to think. Tyler had built it out of 3 other bikes and a roomer, Gabe had told Miles last month, when Miles came by for a chain tensioner and pretended he didn't care whether Tyler was working that day. You bring a bottle? Tyler asked finally. Miles shook his head. I brought a spear. Tyler's mouth twitched in something that might have been a smile in another life. Then I'll bring the bottle, he said. He stubbed out the cigarette, tossed it into a coffee can slick with old butts and oil rainbows, and stood. When he came around the bench, he moved like he was made of wire and purpose, every motion efficient, nothing wasted. He hooked a finger in Miles's shirt and pulled him close and sniffed, not like a joke. Like he was checking. You smell like cedar, he said, and salt. He did smile then, but it had no teeth in it. You went full witch on me. Bring your bike, Miles said. Born to, Tyler replied. He grabbed a battered denim jacket off a hook, shrugged it on, checked his pockets for the things a kid like him considered holy Zippo, oil rag. A folded photograph creased white where it had been opened and closed too many times. He didn't show Miles what it was. He didn't need to. Miles knew the shape of 2 brothers' faces by heart and by absence. They needed 2 more. 4 was the number that mattered. Miles had learned that from the old men in the bars. 4 directions, 4 winds, 4 corners to hold a thing in place. You didn't hunt something like the bone collector alone, and you didn't do it with just 2. 2 meant one of you could get picked off and the other would be alone. 3 was unstable, always someone on the outside of the conversation, always someone who'd run first. But 4 made a shape that could hold. O'Fleon was knocking dents out of a Chevy hood behind the community center in a haze of spray paint, his height making the ball-peen hammer look like a toy in his massive hands. He was a good kid, everyone said so. The kind of kid who helped old ladies with groceries and never complained when his shift got extended because someone else called in sick. His face would have made grandmothers call him sweet if that same face didn't look like it had been stretched onto a 6'5" frame by accident, features spread a little too far apart, eyes a little too wide. His hands were the size of dinner plates. When Miles stuck his out to shake, Oph swallowed it completely, warm and calloused and careful, like he'd learned early that he could hurt people without meaning to and spent his whole life trying not to. Miles, Oph said, surprised but not unhappy. His voice was slow, thoughtful, deeper than you expected even from someone his size. Tyler, what's up? We need you, Miles said straight out, because Oph didn't do well with complicated explanations. He got confused trying to follow multiple threads, so you gave him one thing at a time and let him work through it. We're going up to Arroyo Seco, tonight. There's something there that needs handling. Oph's big brow folded, confusion creasing his forehead. Like a job? Like a monster, Tyler said flatly, flicking ash from a fresh cigarette. He didn't look at Oph when he said it, just stared at a crack in the concrete like it held answers. Oph blinked slowly, set down the hammer with care, like he was buying time to think. That place. He trailed off, then tried again. I heard things. About what happened there. About you 2. You heard, Tyler said, voice hard and empty. People always hear, and then they tell themselves they heard it wrong so they can sleep. Oph looked at the hammer, at the spray paint, At the shadow the community center threw across the asphalt, a square of kindness that had sheltered him more than once when he'd run out of places to be. His mother worked nights at the hospital. His father drank. The community center had been the third place he'd lived more than either home or school. "I'm not fast," he warned, as if the problem might be his. "I'm big, but I'm slow. If we have to run—" "We're not running," Miles said. "We need somebody hard to knock down. Somebody who doesn't scare easy when a sound is wrong." Ove considered this with the serious weight he gave to all decisions, from what to order at lunch to whether to help a friend do something that might get them killed. Finally, he nodded once. "Okay," he said. He went inside the community center and came back 5 minutes later with a backpack that looked like it used to be a duffel, a coil of nylon rope, and a framing hammer with a waffle head that could drive 16-penny nails through concrete. He'd been waiting to be asked. Miles could see it in the way Ove held the hammer, not like a tool, but like a promise. Miguel Hernandez was in the alley behind El Rio with a paper boat of carne asada fries he'd liberated from the to-go window with a smile that made girls roll their eyes and cooks forget the actual price. He wore a flat-brimmed Dodgers cap despite how the old men would cluck their tongues, and a gold chain that might have been from a pawn or an uncle who'd felt generous once. He said what he had to say with his shoulders first chest forward, chin up, like he was walking into a room where every chair had his name sharpied on the back. He'd been caught once with a switchblade he didn't know how to open, and twice with a mouth that couldn't choose quiet when quiet would have been wise. But his mother worked double shifts at the hospital, and his father lined his boots at the door every night before dinner, and when Miguel got too loud, those boots would cross the kitchen slow and sure until Miguel remembered how to find his volume knob. "A road trip?" Miguel said, wiping grease from his fingers onto his jeans, then thinking better of it and grabbing napkins from the boat. His eyebrows climbed behind the brim. "With you two?" He flicked a glance to Tyler and found no smile waiting. "Where are we going?" "Seco," Miles said. Miguel whistled softly, then caught himself doing it and swore under his breath. He made a sign against the evil eye the way an aunt had taught him, because you don't grow up in northern New Mexico without learning a dozen ways to tell the air you respect the things you can't see. "You're messing with me," he said, but his voice had gone uncertain. "No," Tyler said flatly. Miguel grinned, too quick, the expression sliding on like armor. "Then yeah, I'm in." "I'm always down." He pointed at Miles' bow, at the spear, at the pouch Miles had thought he'd hidden well enough under his shirt. "We doing this like Boy Scouts or like a movie?" "Neither," Miles said. "We're doing it like we want to walk away after." Miguel's grin wobbled for half a second before finding itself again. He tapped the brim of his hat and slung his arm around Ove's shoulders to feel taller than he actually was. "Let's go see your ghost, Hondo," he said. "Then I can tell every girl at the roller rink how I saved your ass." "You're going to run your mouth and then you're going to run," Tyler said dryly, flicking his cigarette out into the alley and grinding it under a boot heel that had seen more road than sense. "But fine, we need 4. 4 is a number that makes things think twice." Miles didn't tell him the thing they were going to see had never thought once. It just acted, patiently, inevitably, like water wearing down stone. They loaded the bed of Page's pickup with what Miles called necessary and Miguel called insane. Water jugs, 4 gallons in plastic milk containers that sloshed when you moved them. A first aid kit that was mostly duct tape and gauze but also had a suture kit Miles had bought from a vet supply catalog. A coffee can filled with salt and cedar shavings and copper pennies, because copper was supposed to interfere with spiritual energy or something. Miles had read it in a book at the library and figured it couldn't hurt. Rope. A lot of rope. Enough to tie down a bull or hang 4 bodies if everything went wrong. Tyler swung onto his motorcycle, rolled his shoulders under the denim like he was shaking off a coat he didn't want to be wearing but couldn't seem to take off. The engine caught with a snarl that made pigeons scatter from the telephone wires. Ove climbed into the truck bed and braced himself against the cab, his head automatically ducking under a sky that had nothing in it to hit. 3 years of door frames had taught him to duck even when he didn't need to. Miguel took passenger seat and immediately put his boots up on the dashboard until Miles told him to move them. Miguel moved them exactly 1 inch, just to see if it would make a point. It didn't, but he left them there anyway. They left Taos when the heat had begun to make the road shiver and dance, mirages pooling in the low spots. The 2-lane cut a black seam through scrub and pinyon and the kind of emptiness that isn't empty so much as it's full of things that don't care you exist. Tyler rode ahead sometimes, the bike slung low and lazy, engine sound punching holes in the heat. Sometimes he fell back and let the wind eat his face until his eyes watered and he could pretend that meant he felt something other than the weight of 3 years. Miguel tried to talk. He was good at it, had built a whole personality out of filling silences other people didn't know how to sit in. He told a story about a fight behind the bowling alley that had started over a girl named Teresa and ended when the 2 boys realized they were actually friends and had no idea what to do with their hands once the anger ran out. He told a story about a guy he knew who knew a guy who swore he'd seen a woman walking along the Acequia in a white dress that never got wet. But his aunt had told him that everybody saw that woman when they'd been drinking and needed something to blame the morning on. He told a joke that wasn't really a joke, about a sheriff who only wrote up the kind of accidents insurance companies understood. And wasn't it funny how the weird shit always got filed under equipment failure or animal activity? When he ran out of stories, he hummed along to a song that wasn't on the radio anymore, something from 5 years ago that had been big for a summer and then disappeared. His voice wasn't bad, just nervous. Oaf didn't talk. He sat in the truck bed with his arms draped over the sides, letting the wind hit him square, watching the road unspool behind them and the mountains grow larger ahead. He rolled his shoulders like he could fit himself smaller if the wind asked him nicely, his t-shirt pressed flat against his chest, showing the shape of a kid who could deadlift an engine block if you asked him. Who would do it not because he wanted to prove he could, but because you asked, and that was enough. Miles drove and let the road come through his hands, the steering wheel vibrating with every crack in the pavement. The scars under his shoulder pulled when he checked the blind spot, and he caught himself doing it even when there was nothing there but scrub and heat shimmer. He kept half an eye on Tyler in the rearview mirror. The other half watched the mountains cut deeper color out of the blue as they climbed in elevation. "Tell me the rules again," Miguel said at one point, when the truck's shadow had settled into a steady companion on their left and the sun had shifted high and mean overhead. He said it like a dare, but there was a polish of real curiosity under the swagger, the way a good kid who'd taught himself to seem bad sometimes couldn't help wanting to know the homework anyway. Miles touched the pouch of salt again without meaning to, then made himself take his hand away before it became a tell. "Don't whistle," he said, taking them off like a grocery list. "Don't say a name if you hear it said wrong. Don't follow anything that sounds like someone you love. Don't step into the river if your shadow looks different on the water than it does on dirt. If you have to cross, you leave salt and cedar and a little blood if it asks." Miguel made a face like he'd bit into something sour. "Our blood?" "If it asks," Miles repeated. "What happens if you break a rule?" Oaf asked from the bed, the wind stealing half his words and throwing them back in his face. "You leave," Miles said. "Fast as you can. You don't try to fix it. You just run and don't stop until the sun comes up." "Good rules," Tyler said from the bike, swinging back into the lane ahead of them in time to catch the turn at the little intersection where the 2-lane dipped and the signs got older and the paint faded until it stopped being helpful. He didn't look back when he said it. Didn't have to. They all knew who the rules were for. They were for boys who didn't want to admit they were still boys. They were for men who were tired of the way the world lied to you about the things you had to pretend you didn't hear. The land changed in the way land always changes when you get close to a place you've decided to name in your head. Fences grew out of the scrub and then sank back down like they'd never been committed to the idea. Houses leaned away from the road as if the wind had pushed them once, and they decided that was easier than standing straight. The line of cottonwoods that always promises water rose ahead, leaves fluttering like 1,000 green hands making 1,000 small, meaningless promises. The air cooled by a degree you only notice if you came up out of the kind of heat that makes thoughts go soft. The smell of water crept into the truck through vents that weren't even open, that mineral and green smell of rivers that had been running since before humans thought to give them names. Tyler put a hand up without looking and pointed with 2 fingers their old signal from skating, the one that meant obstacle ahead, pay attention. Miles nodded once and turned off onto a smaller road that wasn't really a road anymore, just 2 tire tracks mineralized by habit and drought. The truck rocked. Oaf rode the bumps like a barge in heavy seas, barely moving. Miguel gripped the oh-shit handle above the passenger door, the one that was never meant for 19-year-olds. The one mothers grabbed when their husbands took corners too fast and tried to pretend his knuckles weren't white. No one talked for a while. It was enough to listen. The engine making the sound of a heart when the heart is being good. The thrum of Tyler's motorcycle eating pavement. The whisper of wind in cottonwood leaves that always sounds like gossip in a language you don't speak but somehow understand means you're not welcome. Tyler lifted his hand again without looking back, and Miles eased off the gas. The truck rolled easy up a long hill whose crest they couldn't see until they were on it. For one heartbeat the world was only sky massive and blue and indifferent. Then the land broke open. The Sangre de Cristo mountains took the sun full in the face and threw it back like a weapon. The ridges went the color of fresh blood spilled over snow, every canyon and cliff face painted in shades of red that didn't exist anywhere else on Earth. The light didn't just catch their eyes, it hit them. Struck like a thrown bottle, like a revelation that rewrites what you thought you knew about color. Miguel cursed softly, blinking hard. Wolf squinted and lifted one massive hand like the light could be pushed aside if he were strong enough. Tyler's head turned just enough for the sun to strip his profile down to a cutout jaw, nose, the hard line of a boy who'd had to learn too young how to hold himself so the wind couldn't knock him over. Miles felt the heat of it in his tear ducts and didn't look away. For one breath the world held still under that color, and he thought about the name Sangre de Cristo. Blood of Christ, and how some names aren't poetry but warnings written by people who survived long enough to shape words with their mouths before they died. They rolled over the crest and the world moved again. Wind came back, tires found purchase, and the truck began to descend into the bowl of the valley where Arroyo Seco lay with its houses and fields, and the scar where a building had been and should never have been built in the first place. The sun slipped a step down the mountain and the color calmed into something men could live under without going blind. Then something else moved. Not wind, not engine sound. Something that slipped across the road and through the open windows and into their ears with that old, impossible steadiness, a sound so thin it could have been thread, so deliberate it could not be anything natural. A whistle, high and hollow and patient as cancer. Miguel's mouth shut around whatever word he'd been about to say. Oaf's fingers dug into the truck bed rail until the metal sang a faint note of stress. Tyler's shoulders went very still on the motorcycle, the loud machine somehow sounding small and childish against that high, wrong note threading through the valley. Miles didn't breathe. For a heartbeat, none of them did. They told themselves it was wind through grass, through a crack in a rock, through the gap in a fence post. But deep down in the place where your spine knows things your brain refuses to name, every one of them knew better. It was calling them home. And home was hungry. Chapter 3. The House That Remembers. The road spat them out into the valley like it wanted them gone, and by the time they rolled past the last stand of cottonwoods, Arroyo Seco opened up in front of them the way a scar opens when you bend wrong. The ruined house still stood, if you could call it standing. The second floor had been a ghost for 13 years now, burned away in that fire nobody talked about properly. The one the official report called a grease fire, but everyone knew had started in the walls and burned hottest on the riverside. But now even the bones of the first floor were rotten. Charred joists jutted upward like ribs on a carcass left for vultures, black teeth against the bruised sky that was already starting to think about evening. Weeds pushed up between the foundation stones, not delicate wildflowers, but the tough, ugly scrub that grows where nothing good has happened. The old wooden staircase still leaned against the ruin. The one that used to lead to the second floor before the fire took it. The one Tyler's grandfather had refused to tear down because he said it was historical, gave the place character. It looked more warped now, each step sagging under its own weight, the wood silvered and splitting. It looked like it had been waiting for them. Miles felt his chest tighten. He could see himself up there again, 18 years old, legs dangling off the roof with Tay-Tay and J-Rod beside him and Tyler. The summer of 1985 stretching out like a promise before the whistle cut it in half. The laughter, the stolen beer. The moment before everything became blood and screaming and the worst sound in the world, which wasn't the monster but Tyler's voice breaking when his grip finally slipped. Miguel leaned forward in the passenger seat, pushing his hat back. "Damn," he said quietly. "That's it?" "That's it," Miles said. His voice came out flat, dead. Off climbed down from the truck bed, wiping his hands on his jeans even though they weren't dirty. He didn't say anything, just stood there with his big shoulders hunched, staring at the blackened beams like he was sizing up something too big to lift, trying to figure out the right angle of approach. Tyler killed the motorcycle engine and let it tick down to silence, that particular cooling sound engines make when they're relieved to stop working. He stayed straddled over the bike, smoke curling from the cigarette clenched between his teeth. "Doesn't look any different," he muttered, voice rough. 3 years and it just sat here rotting, like the world forgot it ever mattered. "Not the world," Miles said. He felt the scars on his shoulder itch under his shirt, that phantom heat that had nothing to do with the actual temperature. "Not me." They made camp on the edge of the lot where the weeds broke into dirt, a flat spot that gave them clear sight lines to the house, to the road, to the line of cottonwoods that marked where the river ran. Miles built a small fire with cedar chips and the kindling he'd hauled from Santa Fe. The flames caught quick, sparking orange light across their faces, throwing shadows that moved wrong. The fire should have been comfort, should have been the thing that made the dark smaller, more manageable. It wasn't. Tyler passed around the bottled cheap whiskey in a plastic bottle that he'd bought at a liquor store that didn't care about IDs as long as you had cash. He took the first pull, grimaced, passed it to Oaf. Oaf shook his head, uncomfortable. Tyler shrugged and handed it to Miguel, who pretended the taste didn't make him want to cough, took a sip that was more of a wetting of his lips, and passed it back. Miles waved it off. He needed to stay sharp. The sun died slow over the mountains, bleeding out across the peaks until the Sangres looked like their name, and then the light failed all at once the way it does at altitude. Dark came down like a blanket someone threw over the world. The first whistle came when the flames had settled into a steady burn, high and thin, curling over the ruined house like smoke that could think. It rose long and deliberate, steady as a held breath, as impossible as a held breath, because nothing with lungs could sustain that note. It threaded through the valley with a patience that felt deliberate, like it was tasting the air, finding them. They all froze. Miguel's hand stopped halfway to his mouth, holding a piece of jerky he'd been about to bite. Oaf's shoulders went rigid, every muscle locking. Tyler's hand tightened on the bottle hard enough, the plastic crackled. "That," Miguel started, voice pitched too high. "That's wind, right? Just wind through." "No wind tonight," Oaf said quietly. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the fire crackle, but certain. The sound came again, closer now, not from one direction but from everywhere, as if the thing making it could be in multiple places at once, or as if the valley itself had learned to whistle. The note climbed and held, vibrating at a frequency that made Miles's teeth ache. His stomach dropped, because he could hear it now woven into the whistle, stretched and distorted like someone had taken the syllables of his name and pulled them apart and stitched them back together wrong. Tyler flinched like he'd been slapped, eyes shining red in the firelight. "J-Rod," he whispered. Because he heard it too, his brother's name threaded into the sound, pulled too long, pitched too high, all wrong. Oaf's head jerked up. His lips parted, and though he didn't say it, Miles knew he was hearing his mother's voice, the way she called him in for dinner when he was young, before his father started drinking, before home became a place you left as soon as you could. Miguel let out a sharp laugh that had nothing to do with humor. "I heard me," he said, voice cracking. "I heard myself, man." Like I was whistling back to "He cut himself off," making the sign against evil again, fingers shaking. "Don't listen," Miles said. His own voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else's mouth. "Whatever it says, however it sounds, don't listen." The whistle slid away, fading toward the cottonwoods, toward the river. It left something behind, a pressure in the chest, a weight that made breathing feel deliberate. The fire snapped and guttered low, even though Miles had just fed it. Shadows lengthened, curling like fingers reaching toward their little circle of light. They sat closer after that, shoulders nearly touching, each one pretending they weren't terrified but fooling exactly no one. "Why is it doing that?" Miguel asked after a long silence. "The voice thing. Why?" Miles poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up. "It collects them," he said quietly. "Every person it takes, it keeps their voice, uses them like bait, I guess, or trophies. I don't know." "That's fucked up," Miguel muttered. "Yeah," Tyler agreed, taking another pull from the bottle. "It is." Nobody suggested turning in early. They just sat there as the fire burned down to coals and built it back up, as the stars came out thick and cold overhead, as the temperature dropped and their breaths started to plume white. They took turns feeding the flames, keeping the light alive, because the alternative sitting in the dark while that whistle circled them was unthinkable. Somewhere around midnight, Oaf stood and stretched, his spine popping like firecrackers. "I'll take first watch," he said. "You sure?" Miles asked. Oaf nodded, gripping his framing hammer. "I'm not sleeping anyway. Might as well be useful." Miles wanted to argue, wanted to say they should all stay awake, all stay together, but he could see the determination in Oaf's face, the need to prove he wasn't just the big guy who carried things. So he nodded. "Wake me in 2 hours. We rotate." They tried to sleep. Miguel wrapped himself in a blanket and curled up close to the fire, hat pulled down over his eyes. Tyler sat with his back against the truck tire, arms crossed, chin on his chest, not sleeping but not quite awake either, existing in that gray space trauma teaches you. Miles lay down but kept his hand on the spear, eyes half open, watching the stars wheel overhead and trying not to think about how J-Rod and Tay-Tay had looked at those same stars 3 years ago and didn't know they'd be dead before sunrise. Oaf walked the perimeter of their camp, hammer resting on his shoulder, boots crunching on the dry ground. Every 15 minutes or so he'd circle back to the fire, check that everyone was still breathing, then head out again. He was a good kid. Miles had known that when he asked him to come. Loyal. Steady. The kind of person who'd stand between you and danger not because he thought he could win, but because he thought it was the right thing to do. That's why the creature took him first. The whistle came back sometime after 1 in the morning, soft as a lullaby. Miles stirred awake to the sound of it, that high, thin, threading note that bypassed his ears and went straight into his spine. He sat up fast, heart already hammering, and saw Oaf standing at the edge of the firelight with his head cocked, listening to something Miles couldn't quite hear yet. "Oaf," Miles hissed, scrambling to his feet. "Don't listen to it." But Oaf wasn't looking at him. His eyes had gone distant, glassy, fixed on something out in the dark beyond the fire's reach. His mouth moved, forming a word Miles couldn't hear from this distance. Then Oaf spoke, voice small and cracked, and nothing like the deep rumble they were used to. "Mom?" "Oaf." "No." Miles started forward. But Oaf was already walking, not toward the ruins, not toward the river, but toward a patch of empty ground between their camp and the buffalo field. He moved like someone dreaming, like someone following a voice only he could hear. His hammer dangled loose in his hand, forgotten. Tyler jerked awake, eyes snapping open. "What?" The ground beneath Oaf opened. That's the only way Miles could describe it later, when the sheriff asked him what happened, when he had to lie and say sinkhole, unstable ground, terrible accident. But it wasn't a sinkhole. The earth didn't collapse or crumble. It opened, like a mouth, like something beneath had been waiting there with infinite patience and simply chose that moment to take what it wanted. Oaf didn't even scream. There was just a heavy thud, the sound of his body hitting something solid but wrong, and then the earth shook once, a deep subsonic rumble that rattled their teeth, and he was gone. Just gone. Like he'd never been there at all. The hammer clattered on the dirt, the only proof he'd existed, spinning twice before coming to rest. "Oaf!" Miguel's scream tore the night. He scrambled to his feet, blanket tangling around his legs, and ran toward the spot where Oaf had vanished. Miles and Tyler got there first, flashlights cutting wild arcs through the dark. They fell to their knees at the edge of where Oaf had been standing, shining their lights down. The ground was unbroken, completely unbroken, just dust and weeds and drag marks scored into the dirt-long furrows like something with claws had gripped him from below and pulled. But no hole, no crack, no explanation that made sense. "Where is he?" Miguel's voice cracked, hovering between rage and panic. "Where the fuck is he?" Miles pressed his hands flat against the earth, as if he could feel through it, as if pressure alone could make it give Oaf back. The ground was cold, solid. But underneath, he swore he could feel something moving, something shifting, something satisfied. Tyler sat back on his heels, face drained of color in the flashlight beam. His jaw worked, but no sound came out for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, dead. It took him. "We have to dig," Miguel said frantically. "We have to." "There's nothing to dig," Miles said. His throat felt raw. "He's not down there. Not anymore." It pulled him through. "Through what?" Miguel demanded. "Through dirt? Through fucking bedrock? That's not possible." "Neither is a whistle that uses your dead brother's voice," Tyler said, voice sharp and jagged. "But here we are." Miguel stared at them both, chest heaving, eyes wide and wet. For a second, Miles thought he might run, just bolt for the truck, for the bike, for anywhere that wasn't here, but Miguel stayed. Kid had more spine than any of them had given him credit for. Tyler rounded on Miles, and there was something feral in his face, something raw and bleeding. "You brought us here," he said, spit flying. "You and your damn obsession. You couldn't let it die, couldn't move on, and now Oaf." His voice broke. He grabbed Miles by the shirt, twisted the fabric. "You happy now? You get what you wanted?" Miles didn't fight back. Let Tyler shake him, let the anger pour out, because Tyler was right. He had brought them here. He'd known it was dangerous and he'd asked them to come anyway, and now a good kid who just wanted to help his friends was gone, pulled into the earth by something that shouldn't exist. "No," Miles said quietly. "I'm not happy. I'm not anything. But running won't bring him back. And it won't stop this thing from taking someone else." "So what?" Tyler demanded. "We just keep going? Pretend Oaf didn't just—" He cut himself off, let go of Miles's shirt, turned away. His hand shook as he pulled out another cigarette, fumbled with his lighter 3 times before getting it lit. Miguel was pacing now, quick, nervous strides, muttering in Spanish, hands gripping his hair. The switchblade appeared in his hand. Miles hadn't even seen him pull it, and he kept flicking it open and closed, the click of the blade becoming a metronome for his panic. Miles picked up Oaf's hammer. It was still warm from his grip, heavy, the kind of weight that promised you could fix things if you just hit them hard enough. He set it carefully in the truck bed, unable to look at it anymore. The whistle came again, triumphant now, layered with voices, Tay-Tay's high giggle, J-Rod's sarcastic drawl, and underneath them, new and wrong and horrible, Oaf's deep voice saying "Mom" over and over, stretched so long the word lost meaning. Tyler's face twisted. He grabbed the wrench from his bike, heavy steel, and roared at the darkness. "Come on then! You want another one? Come, get me!" "Tyler, don't," Miles started. But Tyler was already moving toward the ruins, toward the staircase, rage propelling him forward. Miles and Miguel scrambled after him. They reached the foundation just as something moved in the wreckage. The bones had come back, stacked neat against the foundation stones, arranged with surgical precision, a fan of ribs, long pale femurs balanced one over the other, a jawbone laid on top like punctuation. New bones too fresh enough they still had tissue clinging to them, dark meat going black in the moonlight. Tyler swung the wrench and shattered a rib, the bone exploding into splinters. "Fuck your bones! Fuck your whistling!" Miles grabbed his arm. "Stop! You're just making it angry." "Good," Tyler screamed. "Let it come. Let it come." The whistle rose again, so loud now it felt like it was inside Miles' skull, vibrating through his jaw, making his vision blur. The ruins groaned, old wood shifting, beams settling, but with intention, with weight. Something was in there, moving through the wreckage, coming toward them. "Run," Miles said. For once, Tyler listened. They sprinted back to the camp, chests heaving, and dove for their weapons. Miles grabbed the spear and the bow. Tyler kept his wrench, added a tire iron from the truck. Miguel's switchblade looked pathetic next to their weapons, but he held it like it was a sword, knuckles white. They stood in a triangle with their backs to the fire, watching the dark close in from all sides. The whistle moved, not from one place but everywhere, circling their camp like a predator testing a perimeter. It slid through the buffalo field and the herd answered with panicked bellows, hooves thundering, the fence rattling under their weight. It threaded through the cottonwoods by the river, and the leaves went silent, every bird and insect suddenly mute. It climbed the stairs of the ruined house, each creak deliberate, patient. And in the whistle now, clear and terrible, were three voices, Tay-Tay, J-Rod, Oaf, calling them, begging them, laughing at them. Tyler's hand shook on the wrench. Miguel whispered prayers in Spanish, the words tumbling over each other. Miles planted his feet and leveled the spear at the darkness, obsidian point gleaming in the firelight. "We don't run," he said. "We finish this, tonight." Because running meant someone else would be next. Running meant another crew of kids would come to this place thinking it was adventure, thinking they were invincible, thinking the old warnings were just stories. Running meant J-Rod and Tay-Tay and Oaf died for nothing. The fire guttered, the shadows grew teeth, and something at the edge of the light began to take shape, tall and thin and bent in too many places, bones rattling like laughter, flesh white as drowned things. It was time. Chapter 4. The River Runs Red. Morning came gray and indifferent, settling over the valley like ash. The fire had burned down to nothing in the night, just a scatter of white flakes that clung to their boots and wouldn't shake loose. Oaf's hammer lay in the truck bed where Miles had placed it, black-stained at the waffle head, and every time Miles looked at it his stomach turned over. They hadn't slept, couldn't, They'd spent the hours between midnight and dawn in that tight triangle, backs to the dead fire, weapons ready, watching the thing circle them just beyond the reach of their lights. It never came closer. Never attacked, just circled, whistled, waited, testing them, tasting their fear. When the sun finally crawled over the Sangre de Cristos, the whistling stopped. The presence faded like morning fog. But it left something behind, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, a weight in the air that pressed on their skulls. Tyler was a ruin. He sat on his haunches beside the motorcycle, hands locked over his mouth, eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He hadn't spoken since his rage burned out somewhere around 3 a.m., leaving only the ash of exhaustion and grief. His face was pale, streaked with soot from the fire and salt tracks that had nothing to do with smoke. Miguel paced. He'd been pacing for hours, quick, nervous strides that ate up 10 feet of ground and then reversed, over and over, muttering curses in Spanish that had gone from angry to scared to numb. His hat was gone, lost somewhere in the scramble. The gold chain had snapped off, and he kept reaching for it automatically, fingers finding nothing, confusion flickering across his face each time. Miles stood at the foundation of the ruined house, staring at the bones. They were different now, more of them, fresh ones mixed with the old. A calf's skull, eye sockets packed with dirt. Finger bones small enough to be a child's, though Miles told himself they were just small animal bones. Had to be. The jawbone was human, though, adult, old enough the teeth had worn flat. He knelt and touched one of the ribs. It was cold, so cold it burned his fingers. He jerked back, and for just a second, just a flicker, he saw faces in the bone's surface, pressed against it from the inside like people trapped in ice. He stumbled back, heart hammering. "We can't stay here," Miguel said from behind him, voice hoarse from disuse and panic. "Miles, man, we can't. It's gonna pick us off one by one until—" "Until what?" Miles cut him off, turning. "Until we run? And then what, Miguel? It waits for the next people? For some family to rent this place next summer?" "I don't care." Miguel's voice cracked. "I don't care about next summer. I care about right now. Hope is gone, man, gone. We didn't even get to." His voice broke completely. He turned away, shoulders shaking. Tyler finally looked up. His eyes were empty, scraped clean of everything except a cold kind of understanding. "Miles is right," he said quietly. "We run. It follows. That's what it does. It waits." "Then what do we do?" Miguel demanded. "How do you kill something that pulls people through solid ground, that takes your voice and wears it like jewelry?" Miles touched the pouch of salt and obsidian at his belt. "We find its core, the thing it's built itself around, and we destroy it." Tyler rose slowly, every movement careful, like his bones might break if he moved too fast. "It's in the house," he said. "Has to be. That's where it started, where the fire tried to finish it." Miles nodded. "The whistle throat, the thing it uses to make the sound. It'll be built from bones, probably hidden in the crawl space or the foundation." They gathered their weapons with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. Miles took the spear, the bow, the obsidian shard. Tyler grabbed his wrench and tire iron, testing their weight. Miguel clutched his switchblade and picked up a length of rebar from the ruins, holding it like a club. They approached the house as the sun climbed higher, heat starting to press down. The buffalo in the field across the road watched them, uneasy, shifting and snorting. They knew. Animals always knew. Inside the ruins, the smell hit them, first old smoke and rot and something else, something organic and wrong, like meat left in water too long. The floor was unstable, charred boards that sagged under their weight. Weeds grew up through cracks, reaching for light that barely penetrated the wreckage. "There," Tyler said, pointing. In the corner where the house had faced the river, where the fire had burned hottest 13 years ago, The floor had collapsed into a crawl space, and in that darkness, something gleamed pale. They climbed down carefully, dropping into the space beneath. It was tight, maybe 4 feet of clearance, forcing them to crouch. The dirt floor was packed hard, littered with debris from the fire. And there, in the center, was the source. A column of vertebrae, human vertebrae, wired together with sinew that had dried to leather, stacked with impossible care to create a hollow tube. Small bones, finger bones, toe bones, maybe children's bones, though Miles couldn't let himself think about that, threaded through the gaps between vertebrae, creating chambers and passages like the reed of some grotesque flute. It pulsed faintly, not breathing, but something like it, a rhythm that had nothing to do with hearts. Tyler gagged, pressed his hand over his mouth. Jesus Christ. "Break it," Miles said. "Break it now." He grabbed Oaf's hammer from where he'd brought it, lifted it high, and brought it down with every ounce of strength and rage and grief in his body. The vertebrae cracked, split. The sinew snapped with sounds like gunshots. A wet sigh gusted through the ruins, sour and cold as grave dirt. The house groaned around them, beams shifting. All 3 of them staggered back as the air itself seemed to exhale. Outside, the whistle faltered, dropped an octave. The note went ragged, broken, angry. "Again!" Tyler shouted. They took turns, Miles swinging the hammer, Tyler using the tire iron, Miguel stabbing with the rebar, all of them attacking the column until it shattered completely, bones scattering across the crawl space. The whistle swelled in response, no longer patient, no longer testing. It rose into a shriek, not one voice but dozens, a chorus of stolen throats all screaming at once. The ruin shook. Bones clattered against the walls, hurled from the shadows by no hands they could see. A femur smacked the truck door hard enough to dent metal. A ribcage exploded against Tyler's boot, shards embedding in the leather. And the voices Oaf's laugh broken into jagged syllables. J-Rod's name stretched wrong, Tay-Tay's high pitch strangled until it cracked into static. They came from every direction, overlapping, drowning thought. "It's coming," Miguel screamed. "It's coming." "Good," Miles snarled. He grabbed the rope, the salt, the cedar. "Tyler, the river. We drive it to the river." They scrambled out of the crawl space and ran for the cottonwoods. Behind them, something massive moved through the ruins, not walking but flowing, bones grinding, that awful whistle building into something that felt like it could crack the sky. They reached the river bend as the sun hit noon, heat pressing down like a hand. The water here moved slow and black, curving around the gathering place the old Pueblo people had warned about. Cottonwood roots twisted deep into the banks, breaking through the earth like arthritic fingers. Miles and Tyler worked fast, tying the rope between trees, soaking it in cedar smoke from a bundle they lit with Tyler's Zippo. Miguel splashed salt in a line across the narrowest point of the bend, hand shaking so badly he spilled half of it. The river bulged. Not like something rose from beneath, not natural at all. The water mounded upward, defying gravity, rising in the center of the bend like the surface of a bubble being pushed from below by something massive. Then the surface tore. It came up dripping, white limbs folding at joints that bent wrong once, twice, 3 times where human arms only bent once. The fingers were too long, tipped with nails, yellow and thick as horn. Its torso was lean and impossibly elongated, ribs visible through translucent skin, and inside those ribs things moved that shouldn't have been there, shapes that pressed against the skin from within, faces rising and sinking like drowned bodies. Rosaries of bones hung from its shoulders, finger bones, teeth, vertebrae, all strung together with sinew, rattling with every movement like obscene wind chimes. Its head was narrow, skull-like. The skin pulled so tight every ridge and hollow showed through. The eyes were dark pits, wet and reflecting light like oil slicks. No nose, just slits that opened and closed. And the mouth? The mouth hinged too far, opened wider than any jaw should. Inside were teeth, too many teeth, layered like a shark's, clicking together with a sound like bones being sorted. The whistle didn't come from its mouth. It came from its chest, from the space where lungs should be, from the hollow places between its ribs. The sound poured out multi-layered, wrong, filled with every voice it had ever stolen. And there, pressed against its skin from the inside, faces bulging, Miles saw them. Tay-Tay's wide-eyed panic, J-Rod's twisted scream frozen mid-cry, Oaf's broad features, mouth open in an O of surprise. Each one surfaced for a heartbeat, then slipped back under the flesh like sinking stones. Tyler made a sound low in his throat, rage and grief and horror compressed into something that had no shape in language. He charged. Miles roared and drove the spear forward with everything he had. The obsidian point sank into the creature's clavicle with a crack like breaking china, black ichor spraying. The thing shrieked, and the shriek was Oaf's voice, was Tay-Tay's, was J-Rod's, was 100 others twisted together. Tyler swung the tire iron like he was trying to split the world. It connected with one of the bone rosaries, shattered it. A voice cut short mid-whistle, syllables scattering. Miguel darted in and slashed at the tendon cords holding another rosary, severing them, the bones clattering to the ground and going silent. The creature lashed out. Its claws raked Miles's chest, tearing through his shirt, finding the old scars on his shoulder and ripping them fresh. Fire exploded through his arm, white-hot and blinding. He staggered, vision going dark at the edges. It snatched Miguel by the jacket, yanked him off his feet with terrible strength. Miguel screamed, stabbing wild with the switchblade, but the thing's grip was iron. It pulled him close, mouth opening impossibly wide. "No!" Tyler bellowed, rushing forward. But the creature had already made its choice. It hooked both arms into Miguel's chest. There was a wet splitting sound, meat and bone and gristle tearing, and with one brutal yank, it pulled. Miguel came apart. His torso separated from his legs in a spray of blood so hot it steamed in the afternoon air. Organs spilled, glistening. One half of him flew onto the bank, twitching. The other half thrashed in the thing's grip for 3 endless seconds before going limp. Blood painted Miles and Tyler in thick streaks hot across their faces, their arms, their chests. They looked at each other through it, faces unrecognizable, war-painted in Miguel's life. Miguel's scream joined the chorus almost instantly. His voice stretched and bent and added to the whistle that never stopped. Something broke in Tyler then. He howled not words, just sound, and smashed the tire iron into the creature's jaw with every ounce of strength desperation can lend. Teeth splintered, shattered, scattered like dice. Black ichor sprayed his face. Miles grabbed the obsidian shard, drove it into the thing's mouth, and ripped down through the whistle channel. The flesh tore. The sound collapsed into a ragged wheeze, broke into pieces, scattered. "Now!" Miles screamed. Tyler grabbed the fuel can they'd prepared, gasoline mixed with motor oil, the kind that burns blue and hot and angry, and hurled it into the river current. Miles lit the cedar bundle and threw it after. The water caught fire. Blue flames streaked downriver, following the fuel, turning the water into a river of light. The buffalo herd, already agitated, already remembering old instincts, surged forward. The fence had never been strong. It broke easily. Hooves thundered, a wall of muscle and horn and terror-driven rage. They hit the shallows like artillery, crashing through the burning water, forcing the creature back. It thrashed, trying to resist, but there were too many of them, too much weight, too much ancient memory driving them forward. Tyler and Miles added their weight, driving the creature deeper into the current with weapons and fury in the broken pieces of their hearts. The thing's body began to come apart under the onslaught, bones breaking, flesh tearing, the rosaries scattering. For one last instant, Miles saw Miguel's face surface in its skin, eyes wide and empty, mouth open in a scream that had no sound, then Oaf's face beside it, then J-Rod's, then Tay-Tay's, all of them pressed against the inside of the thing's flesh like prisoners in ice. Then the buffalo drove it under. The water churned, bones geysered up, white and clean now, freed from whatever held them together. Black ichor hissed where it touched the fire, evaporating into steam that smelled like rot and old copper. The creature's body tumbled downstream, breaking apart, becoming less a thing and more a collection of parts that had never really belonged together. The whistle died, not all at once, but syllable by syllable, voice by voice, until there was nothing left but the hiss of the river and the thunder of hooves fading into the fields. Silence slammed down in its wake. The fire guttered low, went out. The buffalo scattered, their instincts satisfied, their ancient duty done. The river ran clear again, fast and cold and uncaring. Miles dropped to his knees on the bank, covered in blood that wasn't his, chest heaving. Tyler collapsed beside him, the tire iron slipping from numb fingers. They didn't speak, couldn't. There were no words for what they'd just done, for what they'd just survived, for what they'd had to watch. Miguel's switchblade lay in the dirt, bent and useless. The blade snapped at the hinge. Tyler picked it up with shaking hands, turned it over, set it carefully in his pocket. They didn't bury Miguel. There was nothing whole enough to bury. They gathered what pieces they could find, and there weren't many, and placed them by the river with salt and cedar, the way the old ones used to do for those taken by water. By the time they staggered back to the truck, Page's headlights were cresting the hill. The old man must have felt it somehow, must have known it was time. He said nothing when he saw them, just opened the door and let them climb inside, blood and ash and silence filling the cab. Later, the sheriff's report would read clean and simple: wildfire, buffalo stampede, flood surge, 2 fatalities, tragic but understandable. The kind of thing that happens when young men go places they shouldn't with equipment they don't understand. The town nodded and looked away, as it always had, as it always would. But Miles didn't look away. 3 days later, he stood at the river bend at dusk, obsidian shard blackened and chipped in his hand, and listened. No whistle, not here, not now. The water ran clear and fast and innocent. He didn't smile, didn't feel relief, because he knew. Tyler knew it too. He'd driven up on the motorcycle without being asked, killed the engine, and stood beside Miles without speaking for a long time. "It's not dead," Miles said finally. "No," Tyler agreed. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, stared at the mountains going purple in the falling light. "It's just somewhere else." "Then next time," Miles said, "we follow it, before it builds again, before it takes root." Tyler nodded once, sharp. "Next time we go before it stacks the first bone." Far downstream, past where the valley narrowed and the river went underground through culverts and irrigation channels and forgotten places, water gurgled through old pipes. For just an instant, threading up through the concrete and rebar, came a sound, thin, high, patient. Not quite a whistle. Not yet. Then headlights from the highway swept over, and the sound fell silent. But it would be back. Things like this always came back. They just waited for the right voices, the right boys, the right night when someone forgot the rules and whistled in the dark. And somewhere, in all that patient waiting, it was already gathering new bones, building itself again, one voice at a time. Folklore note. The story you've just heard is fiction, but it's rooted in the continuing mythology of northern New Mexico's hidden places. The bone collector of Arroyo Seco isn't done, not because it's immortal, but because some things are less creatures than they are cycles. They grow, they feed, They wait. And when you think you've ended them, you've only scattered them downstream to gather themselves again. The Pueblo peoples of this region have always understood. Water doesn't forget. Rivers carry memory from the mountains to the desert, and everything that dies near water becomes part of its voice. The warnings change, but the core truth remains. There are places where the spiritual world presses close, where old things linger, where breaking the rules has consequences that don't end when the sun comes up. Buffalo American bison carry their own ancient memory. They're not just animals but witnesses to the deep time before cities, before roads, before we convinced ourselves the world was fully mapped and understood. Their panic, their stampede, their willingness to crash through barriers to drive something back, this behavior appears in indigenous stories across the plains and Southwest. They are the muscle of old laws, the enforcers of boundaries we've forgotten how to respect. The practice of whistling at night remains taboo across many Native American cultures. What answers your whistle might wear your voice, might learn your name, might follow you home. If you visit Arroyo Seco today, you'll find it beautiful, a small community under vast skies, artistic, peaceful. The plaza in Taos is vibrant, the mountains breathtaking. Most nights are simply nights, but ask the old-timers, especially those whose families go back generations, and you might hear other stories about places to avoid when the water's up, about sounds that travel wrong, about the simple rule their grandparents taught them: don't whistle after dark, because something might whistle back, and it might remember the last person who did. Well, 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 kiddies. Looks like Miles and Tyler learned what happens when you try to kill something that's already dead. Poor Miguel, guess he really did get split on the issue. And oaf? More like oh no. But here's the thing, my morbid little friend's breaking the whistle throat didn't kill our bone collector. Oh no, it just scattered him downstream like loose change. He's out there right now, gathering himself piece by piece, voice by voice, waiting for the next fool who forgets Grandma's rules. You know what they say, you can't keep a good monster down, especially when he's made of spare parts. Sleep tight, boys and ghouls, if you can. This has been your late night creature feature. I'm Mr. Wendigo, and I'll be waiting for you next time. The river remembers. The bones remember. And so do I.